Hello! Welcome to this introduction to the European Commission's history and roles. The European Commission is one of the core EU institutions in many of the policy-making processes of the European Union. It can be considered the EU's executive in many, but not all, policy areas. The European Commission is one of the original institutions of the European coal and steel community. It has evolved over the course of time, but many of its core tasks have remained quite stable. Let's start by looking at the European Commission's historical evolution. In the institutional design of the 1952 European Coal and Steel Community, the European Commission was called the High Authority, and it was based in Luxembourg. It had 9 members, 2 commissioners from the big member states and 1 from the small member states. This rule remained in place until the Nice Treaty, which entered into force in 2003. Since then, every EU member state sends 1 commissioner to Brussels. The 1957 Treaties of Rome established one separate commission for the European Economic Community and 1 for Euratom, which was based in Brussels. The 1965 Merger Treaty then merged these 2 institutions and established the Commission of the European Communities, with its main seat in Brussels and a few services in Luxembourg. The 1992 Maastricht Treaty then linked the appointment of the commissioners to the electoral cycle of the European Parliament. Since 1994, the term has been 5 years to match the term of office of the members of European Parliament. The Commission takes up office about 6 months after the European elections. The Maastricht Treaty also introduced the obligation to consult the European Parliament on the candidate for the position of Commission President, and the obligation of a vote of confidence by the European Parliament for the entire College of Commissioners. These changes of the EU institutional architecture were a first step to link the appointment of the European Commission leadership to the European elections. The 1997 Amsterdam Treaty then enshrined the right of the European Parliament to confirm the designated Commission President, instead of merely being consulted on the matter. The 2001 Nice Treaty prepared the EU for the big enlargement of 2004. It reduced the number of commissioners to 1 commissioner per member state. The Lisbon Treaty postulates that when choosing the candidate for the President of the Commission, the European Council should take the outcome of the European elections into account. It also introduces the provision that the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy shall at the same time be one of the Vice Presidents of the European Commission. These changes over time try to reinforce the link between the European Parliament and the European Commission, as well as the link between the EU's foreign and security policy and its internal policies. The European Commission fulfills a number of roles. It is an independent institution that represents the general interest of the European Union. This means that commissioners shall not take instructions from a member state government. As guardian of the interests of the EU, the European Commission's roles can be divided into legislative, representative, and executive tasks. First, the European Commission plays an important role in most legislative processes of the European Union. In the ordinary legislative procedure and in a number of other procedures, the European Commission has the sole right of initiative. No other institution than the European Commission can start the legislative process by issuing a legislative proposal. There are only a few exceptions in special policy areas. The Commission also initiates policies other than laws, or issues documents that will eventually lead to a law. For example, so-called communications set out frameworks for policy priorities. Green papers strive to stimulate discussion at European level on a given topic. And white papers outline proposals for EU action in a specific area. A second role of the European Commission is the external representation of the EU in areas other than the common foreign and security policy. For example, in trade negotiations, the European Commission negotiates with external trading partners on behalf of the entire European Union. Trade is an exclusive EU competence. But also in some areas of mixed competences does the European Commission play a significant role. One example of this are international climate negotiations, where the European Commission, jointly with the Council Presidency, acts and speaks on behalf of the European Union and its member states in plenary sessions. Third, the European Commission fulfills an important executive role in many areas. It possesses delegated rule-making powers. This means that it plays a central role in adopting so-called delegated and implementing acts. These acts fill in details and update existing laws. In this way, necessary details to implement laws can be decided much faster than having to go through lengthy legislative processes. Another task of the European Commission is the execution of the EU budget in areas such as the Common Agricultural Policy and EU cohesion funds. In addition, the European Commission manages EU programs such as the Erasmus Plus program. The European Commission also oversees member state implementation and application of EU laws. When the Commission notices that a member state has not or not correctly transposed an EU law or is acting in violation of an EU law, it will first engage in informal discussions with the respective member state to solve the problem. If this fails, the European Commission will issue a letter of formal notice, which formally starts an infringement procedure. If this phase does not result in a solution between the European Commission and the member state, the Commission will issue a reasoned opinion. This reasoned opinion contains a last warning for the member state and requests it to fulfill its duty to transpose or apply the EU law correctly. If the member state still does not correct the situation before the final deadline, the Commission can bring the case before the Court of Justice of the European Union. Most problems, however, are solved at the stage of the formal notice, which generally gives a member state 2 months to address the issue. The European Commission plays an important role in the EU institutional architecture. It is the institution that represents the general interest of the European Union and that drives forward policy development in numerous areas. It sometimes is called a policy entrepreneur. Due to its right of initiative, combined with representing the general EU interest, the European Commission initiates policies and initiatives, such as the 2019 European Green Deal.